Hidden in the royal archives, there's a document that historians wish didn't exist. Elizabeth I's wardrobe records lists shoes in size 12, larger than most of her male courtiers wore. For a woman in the 1500s, this wasn't just unusual. It was anatomically impossible. And there's a sealed tomb at Westminster Abbey that could prove exactly why, but they'll never let anyone look inside. What if I told you that buried in the royal archives at Kew, inside leather-bound volumes that smell of centuries-old parchment and dust, there's a document that makes historians visibly uncomfortable when you ask them about it directly. These aren't secret letters detailing romantic affairs or scandalous diaries filled with confessions. There's something far more mundane and, paradoxically, far more damning: wardrobe inventories. The Royal Wardrobe Office, staffed by meticulous clerks who understood that their jobs depended on absolute accuracy, kept exhaustive records of every single item Elizabeth I owned throughout her 44-year reign. From jeweled gowns worth more than a nobleman's estate to simple embroidered gloves, from ceremonial crowns to everyday undergarments, everything was documented with obsessive precision. The clerks recorded materials, colors, costs, dates of purchase, and, most importantly for our story, measurements and sizes. And buried in these tedious lists of silk stockings and velvet capes, among thousands of entries that researchers in the 1970s were cataloging for a comprehensive study of Tudor fashion, they discovered something that should have been impossible. Multiple entries, spread across decades of Elizabeth's reign, consistently list shoes in size 12. Not once as a peculiar anomaly, not twice as a possible error, but repeatedly, year after year, ordered and replaced like any other item of clothing that wore out from regular use. For context that will become devastatingly clear, this wasn't some symbolic or ceremonial footwear sitting in a glass display case for state occasions. These were everyday shoes, working shoes, practical shoes that showed wear and tear and needed replacement. The inventories are brutally specific about materials, colors, and occasions, written in the cramped handwriting of clerks who had no reason to lie or exaggerate. One pair of Spanish leather shoes, size 12, for riding purposes, ordered March 1568. Two pairs of velvet slippers, size 12, for indoor wear, delivered June 1572. One pair of hunting boots, size 12, constructed of reinforced leather, commissioned October 1579. The repetition, the consistency, the mundane matter-of-fact tone of these entries is what makes this evidence impossible to dismiss as clerical error, misunderstanding, or the fevered imagination of conspiracy theorists. When these records were first brought to public attention by Dr. Margaret Aston, a respected Tudor historian working on what was supposed to be a routine fashion history project, the academic response was immediate, coordinated, and revealing in its defensiveness. Rather than investigating this anatomical anomaly with the curiosity that should define historical scholarship, established historians rushed to explain it away with arguments that collapsed under the slightest scrutiny. Some claim that Tudor sizing systems were completely different from modern measurements, which is technically true but entirely irrelevant, since the sizing was consistent across all royal records from the period. And we can directly compare Elizabeth's documented shoe sizes to those of her contemporaries using the same measurement standards. Others suggested that the numbers referred to something other than actual foot length, perhaps width measurements or style codes or manufacturing batch numbers, except that the identical numbering system and format applied to Henry VIII's wardrobe clearly and unambiguously indicated foot length, and his size 11 shoes corresponded perfectly with his documented height and build. The most desperate explanation claimed that Elizabeth simply preferred loose-fitting shoes for comfort, walking around in footwear several sizes too large because she found it more pleasant, as if a monarch known throughout Europe for her vanity and obsessive control over her public appearance would deliberately wear clown-sized footwear that would have made her look ridiculous and caused her to trip constantly. But here's what makes the cover-up attempt so transparent that it borders on insulting. The wardrobe records for other female royals from the same period, using the identical measurement system, format, and maintained by the same wardrobe office, show dramatically different numbers that align perfectly with what we'd expect for women of their documented heights. Elizabeth's half-sister Mary I, who ruled immediately before her, wore size 6 shoes according to records kept by the exact same office using the exact same system. Catherine Parr, Henry VIII's last wife, and a woman who actually raised young Elizabeth for several years, wore size 5. Anne Boleyn's wardrobe inventory, preserved because her belongings were confiscated when she was executed, lists size 5 shoes. These were tall women by 16th century standards, and their shoe sizes matched their heights appropriately. Elizabeth's size 12 shoes were literally twice the length of what other queens wore, and this wasn't because of measurement confusion or preference for comfort. Something else was going on, something that required feet significantly larger than any woman of her era naturally possessed. The wardrobe records reveal another unsettling pattern that researchers discovered when they looked beyond just the size numbers. Elizabeth's shoes were custom-made by royal cobblers who worked exclusively for the crown, craftsmen who took precise measurements and created footwear that fit perfectly because their reputation and livelihood depended on royal satisfaction. These weren't mass-produced items grabbed off a shelf. Each pair was measured, designed, constructed, and fitted specifically for the queen's feet. The records show payment receipts to master cobblers, detailed notes about materials and construction methods, and even occasional comments about adjustments needed when a particular pair didn't fit quite right on first try. What this means is that size 12 wasn't an estimate or approximation. It was the measured, verified, confirmed size of the feet that would be wearing these shoes. Royal cobblers didn't just guess or make shoes larger just in case, because disappointing the queen could end their careers or worse. They measured exactly and built exactly to those measurements. Even more revealing, the records show that Elizabeth's shoe size remained consistently large throughout her entire adult life. From her early 20s when she first became queen through her final years in her late 60s, the size stayed 12. This wasn't a temporary condition or something that changed over time. It was her permanent, unchanging foot size across 44 years of documentation. And yet, despite this mountain of evidence sitting in official royal archives, despite the precision and consistency of the records, despite the impossibility of explaining this away through measurement confusion, the historical establishment has collectively decided to simply not talk about it. Modern biographies of Elizabeth, even comprehensive ones running to hundreds of pages, somehow manage to discuss her clothing, her fashion choices, her vanity about appearance, without ever mentioning that she wore shoes larger than most of her male courtiers. The silence isn't accidental. It's deliberate erasure of evidence that points towards something the establishment desperately doesn't want examined. To understand why size 12 feet should have been impossible for Elizabeth, you need to understand the physical reality of 16th century Europeans, and the numbers are shocking when you see them laid out. The average Englishwoman in 1558, the year Elizabeth took the throne, stood approximately 5 feet tall, maybe 5 feet 1 inch if she came from a wealthy family with better nutrition. Their feet were proportionally small, typically ranging from what we'd now call size 4 to size 6 in modern measurements. Even tall noblewomen, those rare individuals who reached 5 feet 6 inches or more, due to superior diet and living conditions, rarely exceeded size 8 shoes. We know this because we have extensive wardrobe records, surviving shoes in museums, skeletal remains that allow us to calculate approximate shoe sizes, and contemporary accounts that describe what was considered normal versus unusual. Now consider this devastating comparison. Henry VIII, Elizabeth's father, was a physically imposing man who stood 6 feet 2 inches tall and was considered a giant for his era. His wardrobe records, maintained by the same office using the same measurement system, show he wore size 11 shoes. Think about that for a moment. The king, who was famous for his massive physical presence, who was described by contemporaries as towering over other men, who wore armor that still exists and shows his enormous frame, wore shoes 1 full size smaller than his daughter allegedly did. Elizabeth's documented height from contemporary descriptions places her around 5 feet 10 inches, tall for a woman but not impossibly so. Yet her feet, according to the royal wardrobe records, were larger than those of her giant father. The proportions don't just fail to match, they're anatomically impossible. Let's get even more specific with the comparisons because the numbers become more damning the deeper you dig. Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester and Elizabeth's lifelong companion, who was considered a tall, athletic man in peak physical condition, wore size 10 shoes according to surviving records from his estate. William Cecil, Lord Bursley, Elizabeth's chief advisor, who served her for 40 years and was described as being of average height and build for a nobleman, wore size 9. Sir Francis Drake, the legendary sea captain and explorer who was noted for his physical toughness and stamina, wore size 9.5. Sir Walter Raleigh, another famous figure from Elizabeth's court, who was considered notably tall and handsome, wore size 10. Every single one of these men, the leading figures of Elizabeth's court who were documented as being tall or average in height, wore shoes smaller than the Queen's size 12. Even more striking, Elizabeth's shoes weren't just slightly larger than other women's. They were enormously, dramatically, impossibly larger. When you see surviving Tudor-era women's shoes in museums, the delicate construction, the narrow width, the tiny sizes that look like they'd fit a modern child, the contrast becomes visceral. We're not talking about Elizabeth having feet that were a bit bigger than average. We're talking about feet that were more than twice the length of what other queens wore. Feet that were larger than those of the most physically imposing men in her kingdom. The only way this makes sense is if Elizabeth's feet weren't proportioned like a biological female's feet at all. Male feet, even when attached to bodies of similar height, are significantly larger than female feet due to skeletal structure, bone density, and the way testosterone affects physical development during puberty. A biological male at 5 feet 10 inches would be expected to wear somewhere between size 10 and 12. A biological female at the same height would wear size 8 or 9 at most. Elizabeth's size, 12 feet, match perfectly with what we'd expect from a biological male of her height. They don't match at all with what we'd expect from a biological female. Here's where it gets even more interesting, and this is where the establishment's silence becomes deafening. Shoe size isn't an isolated characteristic. Foot size correlates directly with hand size, height proportions, shoulder width, and overall skeletal structure. If Elizabeth had unusually large feet, we'd expect to see corresponding evidence and descriptions of her other physical features, and guess what? We do. Foreign ambassadors stationed in London, professional diplomats whose job was to observe and report every detail about the English court, sent back reports that are startling in their consistency. The Venetian ambassador, a man who had served in courts across Europe and had observed dozens of queens and princesses, wrote in an encrypted dispatch that Elizabeth possessed unusually large and powerful hands for a woman, with long fingers that could grip a sword hilt with surprising ease. He wasn't complimenting her. He was confused, trying to make sense of something that didn't match his extensive experience with royal women. Another Venetian envoy, replacing the first after the standard diplomatic rotation, independently noted the same characteristic years later, describing her hands as more akin to those of a soldier than a lady. These weren't coordinated observations or copying from previous reports. These were separate diplomats, years apart, noting the same unusual feature because it was so striking they couldn't ignore it. The French ambassador went even further, documenting in a letter that was meant to be private, but was intercepted and copied by English intelligence, that Elizabeth's hands were nearly as large as His Majesty's own, referring to the French king. This wasn't a casual observation. He was literally comparing the Queen's hand size to that of an adult male monarch and finding them similar. But it wasn't just her hands that drew attention. Multiple diplomatic reports mention Elizabeth's stride and the way she moved through rooms and across grounds. The French envoy wrote that her stride was long and confident, covering ground like a soldier on march rather than gliding as noble women are taught. The Spanish diplomat noted that she walked with a masculine gait that seemed unnatural for one of her sex. These weren't insults or political attacks meant to demean her. These were professional observations from trained spies whose job was to assess potential threats, understand personalities, and report accurate intelligence to their home governments. They had no reason to fabricate or exaggerate these details. If anything, they were trying to make sense of something that genuinely confused them. Contemporary etiquette demanded that noble women take small, delicate steps, barely lifting their feet, creating a gliding effect that was considered the height of feminine grace. Elizabeth apparently walked nothing like this. She took long strides that ate up distance, moved with confidence and speed that contemporaries associated with military men, and showed none of the careful, constrained movement expected of women. Why would she walk this way? The most obvious explanation is that she was taking steps proportional to her actual leg length and foot size, moving naturally rather than adopting the artificial gliding walk that required small feet and shortened steps. Someone with size 12 feet trying to take dainty size 6 steps would look ridiculous and constantly risk tripping. Elizabeth walked the way someone with large feet naturally walks, and it shocked everyone who saw it because it didn't match what they expected from a queen. The most disturbing report came from a Spanish envoy whose name has been lost to history, but whose dispatch nearly caused an international incident. In 1562, this diplomat sent an encrypted message back to King Philip II that was so sensitive it was hidden in Spanish archives for nearly 300 years. The message was brief, just a few sentences, but one line has haunted researchers since the document was finally made public in the mid-1800s. He wrote, referring to Elizabeth, "Her Majesty's form is not as other women's." That's all he said. 7 words that apparently explained everything to King Philip but tell us frustratingly little. The diplomat was immediately recalled to Madrid within days of sending this message, pulled out of England so quickly that he didn't even have time to gather all his belongings or say proper goodbyes to contacts he'd cultivated at court. He never served as a diplomat again and disappeared from historical records shortly after returning to Spain. Whatever he meant by "her form is not as other women's," whatever he had observed or learned or suspected, it was significant enough to end his career and sensitive enough that Spain wanted him out of England immediately before he could see or report anything else. Spanish intelligence was the best in Europe at this time, with networks of spies and informants embedded throughout every major court. They didn't panic over rumors or speculation. They panicked over confirmed intelligence that represented a potential threat or opportunity. Something about Elizabeth's physical form was dramatically different from normal women, different enough that an experienced diplomat felt compelled to report it in encrypted form, and different enough that Spain wanted that diplomat silenced and removed before he could gather more evidence. When you combine this with the shoe evidence, the hand observations, the stride reports, a clear pattern emerges. Elizabeth's body didn't match what contemporaries expected from a woman, and the people who observed her closely enough to notice were either confused by it or actively suppressed their findings. But the wardrobe records reveal something even more telling when you look at the full scope of Elizabeth's clothing choices over her 44-year reign. Every single gown she commissioned, without exception, had the longest skirts of any English royal in history. Her dresses didn't just reach the floor, they deliberately dragged on the ground, creating a train that extended behind her, even when she was walking normally. The wardrobe inventories specify lengths that were excessive even by the extravagant standards of Tudor fashion. Where other queens might have skirts that just touched the floor or extended a few inches beyond their feet, Elizabeth's gowns trailed 18 inches or more behind her as she walked. The official explanation, repeated in countless history books, is that this was simply fashionable, a display of wealth and status that required servants to carry her train indoors and made dramatic statements during public appearances. But this explanation falls apart when you realize that no other queen of the period took the style to such extremes. And more importantly, Elizabeth maintained these impossibly long skirts even in completely private settings where fashion and public display were irrelevant. Her hunting clothes, worn when riding through forests chasing deer, had long skirts that would have been impractical and dangerous, potentially catching in branches or getting tangled in her horse's legs. Her informal gowns for receiving close advisors in private chambers were just as long as her state robes. Even her nightgowns, garments literally designed for sleeping, had excess length that served no possible purpose except concealment. What was she hiding beneath all that fabric? The most obvious answer is her feet. Those size 12 feet that would have been shocking, visible evidence of her unusual proportions if anyone caught a glimpse of them. Look at the portraits, all 137 official images that were painted of Elizabeth during her lifetime. Every single one shows her in floor-length gowns with her feet completely hidden beneath the fabric. This is remarkable because portrait conventions of the period often showed at least the toe of a shoe peeking from beneath a woman's skirt, a small visible reminder of the delicate, dainty feet that were considered a mark of beauty and good breeding. Noble women often specifically requested that portraits show their elegant shoes, sometimes commissioning artists to paint them in positions that deliberately displayed their small feet. Elizabeth never did this. Not once in 44 years of obsessive image control and hundreds of portraits commissioned from the finest artists in Europe did she allow her feet to be visible. Even in hunting scenes where logic and artistic convention would suggest showing her in practical clothing with visible boots, she's painted in impossible floor-length gowns that would have made actual hunting ridiculous. Even in portraits showing her standing near horses or in outdoor settings, where any normal person would have their feet at least partially visible, the artist somehow painted fabric that perfectly concealed her feet entirely. This wasn't accidental or a quirk of artistic style. Portrait artists worked from specific instructions provided by their subjects, especially when painting royalty. Elizabeth clearly insisted that her feet never be shown, and she maintained this rule so strictly that not a single exception exists in the entire visual record of her reign. Compare this to portraits of other queens from the same era. Mary, Queen of Scots, Elizabeth's cousin and rival, appeared in multiple portraits that showed her shoes. Catherine de' Medici, the French queen, was painted with visible feet. Even Elizabeth's own half-sister Mary I appeared in portraits where her shoes peeked out from beneath her skirts. Elizabeth was the only monarch of her era who maintained absolute concealment of her feet across hundreds of images spanning decades. She was hiding them deliberately and consistently, which only makes sense if there was something about those feet that would have raised uncomfortable questions. The farthingale deserves special attention because it represents perhaps the most extreme body concealment garment in the history of European fashion. And Elizabeth didn't just wear them, she popularized them in England and took the style to absurd extremes that went far beyond what other women wore. A farthingale was essentially a hooped framework worn under skirts to create a dramatic wide silhouette. Think of it as a textile architecture that turned the lower body into a geometric shape that bore no resemblance to natural human proportions. The Spanish farthingale, which Elizabeth favored early in her reign, extended skirts directly outward from the waist in a cone shape. The French farthingale, which she adopted later, created a flat surface extending horizontally from the waist before dropping vertically to the floor, making the wearer look like they were standing inside a small tent. Elizabeth's personal farthingales, based on surviving examples and detailed descriptions in wardrobe records, were larger than those worn by any of her contemporaries. Where a typical noblewoman might wear a farthingale that extended 18 inches from her waist, Elizabeth's extended 3 feet or more, creating a massive bell shape that made it physically impossible to determine the actual shape of her lower body. You couldn't see her hips, her legs, her actual waist measurement, or anything else beneath the architectural framework. She was essentially wearing a disguise that concealed her entire lower body shape, and she wore these things constantly in situations where other women would have abandoned them for comfort. She wore them while hunting, while walking in gardens, while sitting for hours in council meetings. The discomfort must have been intense. Farthingales were heavy, hot, restrictive, and made sitting or moving through doorways difficult. Yet Elizabeth wore them religiously for 44 years, only removing them in the absolute privacy of her bedchamber with just her most trusted ladies in waiting present. Why would she subject herself to decades of discomfort unless she was hiding something beneath that would have been even more uncomfortable to reveal? The most logical answer is that her natural body shape didn't match what people expected to see from a woman, and the farthingale made it impossible to detect the differences. The structured bodices that Elizabeth wore tell the same story of deliberate body concealment. These weren't the relatively simple corsets that modern people imagine when they think of historical women's underwear. Tudor bodices were rigid architectural constructions made from wood, whalebone, or metal, covered in fabric and designed to create an artificial torso shape that bore little resemblance to the natural body beneath. They compressed, reshaped, and completely disguised the actual proportions of the person wearing them. Elizabeth's bodices were extreme even by Tudor standards. Longer, more rigid, more heavily structured than those worn by other noblewomen. Wardrobe records describe bodices reinforced with steel bands, constructed so rigidly that they could stand upright on their own when removed, with internal architecture complex enough that getting in and out required assistance from multiple servants. These garments created a smooth, conical torso shape that made it impossible to determine breast size, waist measurement, shoulder width, or any other characteristic that might reveal the natural body. They also required incredibly tight lacing to function properly, which means Elizabeth spent essentially every waking moment being squeezed by a rigid prison that made breathing difficult and free movement nearly impossible. Contemporary accounts mention that she sometimes had to pause for breath during conversations, that she couldn't bend at the waist and had to maintain a rigid posture constantly, that she required help standing up from chairs because the bodice made bending impossible. Why endure this torture daily for 44 years? The obvious answer is that her natural torso shape, without the artificial restructuring, would have revealed something she desperately needed to hide. Male and female torsos have different proportions. Men typically have broader shoulders relative to waist, less dramatic waist definition, and completely different chest structures. A rigid bodice that created an artificial feminine silhouette would be absolutely necessary for someone whose natural torso proportions were masculine. But perhaps the most telling detail in Elizabeth's wardrobe records isn't the shoes themselves, but something researchers discovered when analyzing the orders chronologically. Elizabeth's shoe orders increased in frequency as she got older, but not because shoes wore out faster. The records show a pattern of multiple pairs being ordered simultaneously, far more than any functional purpose required. In her final decade, from 1593 until her death in 1603, She was ordering an average of 8 pairs of size 12 shoes every 3 months. That's 32 pairs a year for a woman who was increasingly frail, spending more time in private chambers and doing far less walking or physical activity than she had in her youth. Why would someone who was barely moving need so many shoes? The explanation becomes chilling when you notice that the new shoes disappear immediately from the wardrobe records after being delivered. They're listed as ordered, paid for, and delivered, but there's no notation of them entering the royal wardrobe storage where other items were cataloged and maintained. They simply vanish. Someone was taking those shoes somewhere immediately upon delivery, and whatever they did with them required a constant fresh supply. Were they being sent to another person who wore the same size? Was Elizabeth maintaining a double? Someone who could appear publicly in her place when she was too ill or frail to perform the role herself? The idea sounds like paranoid conspiracy theory until you remember that Elizabeth's face was hidden behind thick white makeup, her hair was completely covered by elaborate wigs, and her body was disguised beneath architectural clothing. Anyone of the right height with size 12 feet could potentially impersonate her in public appearances, especially during her final years when she rarely spoke in public and mostly appeared in silent, staged processions. The shoe orders suggest something deeply strange was happening, something that required maintaining a supply of footwear for someone whose feet matched Elizabeth's unusual size. Now we need to talk about the Shoemaker because his story is arguably the most disturbing piece of this puzzle. Royal craftsmen in Tudor England were celebrated figures whose names appeared regularly in records, who received honors and recognition, who trained apprentices proud to claim the connection. The man who made the king's gloves, the woman who embroidered the queen's bodices, the jeweler who created the crown jewels. These weren't anonymous servants, but skilled artisans whose association with royalty elevated their entire families. We know their names, their workshops' locations, their apprentices, their careers from start to finish. Except for Elizabeth's Shoemaker, the royal wardrobe records from 1544 through 1565 show regular payments to a cobbler named Thomas Hewitt for shoes delivered to Princess Elizabeth and then Queen Elizabeth. The payments are routine, documented clearly, showing a normal working relationship between craftsman and client. Then, in April of 1565, there's a final payment to Hewitt for services rendered to Her Majesty, and he completely disappears from every historical record. No death certificate was filed in any London parish. No retirement notice appeared in guild records. No apprentices ever claimed to have trained under the man who made Queen Elizabeth's shoes. No property transfers, no will, no estate inventory, nothing. For a man who held one of the most prestigious crafting positions in England, this absence is unprecedented and frankly impossible unless someone deliberately erased him from the records. Other royal craftsmen from the same period have extensive documentation. We can trace their entire lives, their families, their deaths, their legacies. But Thomas Hewitt vanishes in 1565 as if he never existed. And from that point forward, Elizabeth's shoe orders in the wardrobe records don't name the craftsman fulfilling them. They just list paid to cobbler without specifying which cobbler, where they worked, or any other identifying information. Someone wanted Thomas Hewitt to disappear, and they wanted to make sure no one else who made Elizabeth's shoes could be identified or questioned about what they'd observed. The timing of Hewitt's disappearance is significant because 1565 was a crisis year for Elizabeth's marriage prospects. She was 32 years old, which was considered late for a first marriage even by 16th century standards, and the pressure from her council, parliament, and foreign powers to marry and produce an heir was reaching desperate intensity. Her advisors were creating elaborate charts showing her remaining fertile years, calculating how quickly she needed to marry and conceive to have any hope of providing a legitimate successor. The diplomatic correspondence from that year shows negotiations with multiple potential husbands reaching advanced stages, with several foreign princes seriously expecting marriage proposals to be finalized within months. And then Elizabeth shut it all down, definitively and permanently rejecting every candidate and making it clear that she would never marry anyone. The official reasons she gave were political. She couldn't choose a foreign prince without making England subservient to another power. She couldn't choose an English nobleman without creating dangerous jealousies among other nobles. She needed to preserve her independence to rule effectively. But these excuses had been available all along and hadn't prevented her from entertaining marriage negotiations for 7 years. Something changed in 1565 that made marriage go from theoretically possible to absolutely impossible. Thomas Hewitt disappeared in April of 1565. Elizabeth rejected her final serious marriage prospect in June of 1565. And from that point forward, the identity of whoever made her shoes was hidden from the records. What did Thomas Hewitt know? What had he observed in 21 years of measuring and fitting Elizabeth's feet that made him a liability? And what happened in early 1565 that made Elizabeth and her inner circle realize that marriage was no longer a possibility they could continue to pretend might happen? The most obvious explanation is that someone was about to discover the truth about those size 12 feet and what they revealed about Elizabeth's body, and drastic action was taken to prevent that discovery from becoming public. While English historians were busy either ignoring the shoe evidence or concocting increasingly absurd explanations for it, Spanish intelligence was paying very close attention to every detail about Elizabeth's physical characteristics. Spain had the most sophisticated intelligence network in 16th century Europe, with trained agents embedded in every major court, priests who heard confessions from nobles and reported sensitive information to Madrid, merchants who observed and listened, and diplomats who were essentially official spies. Their reports about Elizabeth are remarkably consistent and remarkably disturbing. The Count de Feria, Philip II's senior advisor on English affairs, wrote an encrypted dispatch in 1559, less than a year into Elizabeth's reign, that should have been impossible for him to know. He stated that if his spies do not lie, which he believed they do not, for a certain reason which they have recently given him, he understood that Elizabeth will not bear children. Read that sentence again carefully. Less than a year into her reign, before she had rejected any major marriage proposals, before she had given anyone reason to suspect she might not marry, Spanish intelligence had somehow determined that Elizabeth was biologically incapable of bearing children. This wasn't speculation about her being infertile or too old or politically unwilling to marry. This was intelligence about a biological impossibility, something that his spies had discovered concrete evidence for and reported as established fact. The phrasing, "for a certain reason," suggests they had specific information, not vague rumors or court gossip. They knew something definitive about Elizabeth's physical condition that made childbearing impossible, and they knew it with enough certainty to report it to King Philip II as actionable intelligence. How did they know this? What did their spies observe or learn that gave them such certainty? The most logical explanation is that Spanish agents had somehow gained information about Elizabeth's body that revealed she wasn't capable of pregnancy, either because she had some physical abnormality or, more dramatically, because she wasn't biologically female. The Spanish weren't the only ones gathering intelligence about Elizabeth's physical characteristics. A separate report from 1567, written by a different Spanish diplomat and found in archives in Simancas, specifically mentions Elizabeth's uncommonly large feet that her ladies attempt to conceal with the length of her gowns. This diplomat wasn't repeating earlier reports or drawing conclusions from rumors. He was describing something he had personally observed, presumably during an audience where he caught a glimpse beneath the queen's skirts, or noticed the unusual way she moved and positioned herself to keep her feet hidden. The fact that he specifically mentioned her ladies attempting concealment means this was something unusual enough to require active management by her attendants. Normal-sized feet don't need concealment. Feet so large that they would provoke questions and speculation do. The Spanish report also mentions her masculine gait and stride of unusual length for a woman. Observations that align perfectly with what we'd expect from someone with size 12 feet, trying to walk naturally rather than adopting the mincing, tiny steps that Tudor etiquette demanded of noblewomen. Multiple Spanish intelligence reports from different agents over a span of years describe the same characteristics: large hands, large feet, masculine movement patterns, physical proportions that didn't match expectations for a woman. These weren't coordinated fabrications or propaganda meant to insult Elizabeth. Spain had no reason to invent false intelligence about the English queen's physical characteristics, and every reason to have accurate information about her capabilities, health, and prospects for marriage. These were trained observers reporting what they actually saw, trying to make sense of something that genuinely confused them, based on their extensive experience observing women across European courts. Perhaps most revealing is what the Spanish intelligence reports don't say. They never explicitly state that Elizabeth might be male or that she was replaced by a boy in childhood. They never draw that conclusion directly, which suggests the agents either didn't want to commit such an explosive claim to writing even in encrypted dispatches, or they simply couldn't bring themselves to believe what the evidence suggested. Instead, they dance around the issue with phrases like, "her form is not as other women's," and certain reasons that made childbearing impossible. They describe individual characteristics: large hands, large feet, masculine movement, without stating the obvious conclusion that these characteristics, taken together, suggest a biological male living as a woman. This restraint makes their observations more credible, not less. If Spanish intelligence were making up lies about Elizabeth, they would have been explicit and dramatic, creating scandalous propaganda about her being secretly male to undermine her legitimacy. Instead, they reported confusing observations and let the king draw his own conclusions. Philip II, who received all of these intelligence reports and read them carefully because he was considering whether to invade England or negotiate with Elizabeth, clearly believed there was something fundamentally wrong about her physical form. He never married her, despite it being politically advantageous and despite his advisors suggesting the match. He never attempted to father a child with her through any kind of alliance. And when Spain finally did launch the Armada against England in 1588, the propaganda that Philip circulated to justify the invasion focused on Elizabeth being illegitimate, Protestant, and the daughter of Anne Boleyn, but never mentioned anything about her potentially being male. If he had proof of that, he would have used it to destroy her credibility completely. The fact that he didn't suggest Spain had strong suspicions based on physical evidence, but couldn't quite prove the most explosive possibility. The Spanish intelligence also tracked something that English historians have largely ignored: the complete lack of any physical evidence that Elizabeth menstruated. Ladies-in-waiting kept detailed records of royal health, noting everything from minor colds to digestive issues, and these records typically included discreet notations about monthly cycles because they were relevant to planning public appearances and physical activities. Queens didn't appear at major events during their periods, didn't go riding, and adjusted schedules around this predictable biological reality. The wardrobe records for other queens show regular orders for sanitary supplies, specific undergarments designed for managing menstruation, and adjustments to clothing orders around a monthly cycle. Elizabeth's wardrobe records show none of this. For 44 years, there's no pattern of monthly supplies, no cyclical adjustments, no evidence of the biological process that defined every other woman's life during fertile years. Spanish agents specifically noted this absence in reports from the 1570s, mentioning that their sources within Elizabeth's household confirmed that Her Majesty never experienced the monthly illness that afflicted other women. This wasn't conclusive proof of anything. Some women have irregular or absent menstruation due to various conditions. But combined with everything else, it's another piece of evidence suggesting Elizabeth's body didn't function like other women's bodies. The Spanish clearly found this absence significant enough to include in multiple intelligence reports, treating it as additional confirmation of their suspicion that Elizabeth was physically incapable of bearing children for reasons beyond infertility. What's truly damning is the Spanish intelligence community's absolute certainty about their conclusions. These weren't tentative observations or possibilities they were exploring. By the 1570s, Spanish reports refer to Elizabeth's inability to bear children as established fact, something that required no further investigation or confirmation. They based diplomatic and military strategy on this conclusion, deciding against certain alliances and invasions because they knew Elizabeth would produce no heir, and England would face succession chaos after her death. You don't make major strategic decisions based on court gossip or speculation. You make them based on intelligence you trust completely. And Spain trusted completely that Elizabeth's body made pregnancy impossible. This certainty suggests their agents had access to someone in Elizabeth's inner circle who had direct knowledge of her physical condition, possibly one of her physicians, possibly a lady-in-waiting who had seen her undressed, possibly someone involved in the concealment who became a paid informant. Whoever the source was, they provided information concrete enough that Spain considered it completely reliable intelligence. The fact that these reports remained classified in Spanish archives for nearly 300 years, only becoming public in the mid-1800s when researchers were cataloging historical documents, suggests Spain considered this intelligence extremely sensitive. If Elizabeth's true physical nature had become public knowledge during her lifetime, it would have destroyed her reign, thrown England into civil war, and potentially allowed Spain to install a Catholic monarch without firing a shot. That Spain kept this intelligence secret rather than weaponizing it suggests either they weren't quite certain enough to risk making the claim publicly, or they calculated that a living Elizabeth with a secret was actually more useful than a deposed Elizabeth who would be replaced by a strong successor. Here's where the story takes a turn from historical curiosity to active institutional cover-up. And this is where you can see the establishment's desperate effort to suppress information that's been hiding in plain sight for centuries. When modern researchers finally accessed these detailed wardrobe inventories in the 1970s and began publishing papers about Elizabeth's documented size 12 shoes, the academic response was swift, coordinated, and revealing. Dr. Margaret Aston's groundbreaking paper on Tudor fashion, which included a detailed section on Elizabeth's unusual shoe size, backed by extensive documentation from primary sources, was rejected by the prestigious journal Past and Present with a remarkable editorial comment. The editor wrote that while the research was impeccable and the evidence was correctly sourced, publishing claims about Elizabeth's physical abnormalities would serve no scholarly purpose and might damage the journal's reputation. Read that again. The evidence was admittedly correct and properly documented, but they refused to publish it because it might be controversial. This wasn't academic peer review. This was censorship. Dr. Aston submitted the paper to 3 other major historical journals over the following 2 years. All 3 rejected it with similar reasoning. The evidence wasn't in question, but the implications were too sensitive to publish. One editor explicitly stated that questioning Elizabeth's femininity, even with documentary evidence, was inappropriate for serious historical scholarship. Eventually, Dr. Aston published a heavily modified version that mentioned Elizabeth's shoe size only in a footnote, and removed all analysis of what this might indicate about her physical characteristics. Even that cautious footnote resulted in angry letters from senior historians demanding she retract the claim, despite her providing clear citations to royal wardrobe records that anyone could verify. The message to young historians was clear. If you want a career in Tudor scholarship, don't talk about Elizabeth's feet. The suppression continues to this day, and it's gotten more sophisticated rather than less. Modern biographies of Elizabeth, even comprehensive ones running 800 pages and claiming to be definitive accounts of her life, somehow manage to discuss her clothing, fashion choices, vanity about appearance, health issues, and physical descriptions from contemporaries, without ever mentioning that official records document her wearing size 12 shoes. This isn't accidental oversight, it's deliberate omission of evidence that appears in the source material they're citing. When confronted about these omissions, historians fall back on several defensive arguments. Some claim shoe sizes from the period are impossible to compare to modern measurements, which is false. We have surviving shoes, detailed measurement records, and comparative data from multiple royals that make conversion straightforward. Others argue that Elizabeth simply preferred loose-fitting shoes for comfort, unable to explain why she would choose footwear that would make her look ridiculous and cause her to trip constantly. The most intellectually dishonest argument claims that focusing on Elizabeth's physical characteristics is sexist, reducing a powerful monarch to her body rather than her achievements. This argument conveniently ignores that male monarchs' physical characteristics are routinely discussed in historical scholarship without anyone claiming sexism. And more importantly, that understanding a historical figure's biology isn't reducing them. It's attempting to understand the full truth of their lived experience. If Elizabeth was living with some physical condition that made her different from other women, that affected how she moved through the world, shaped her decisions about marriage and succession, and required constant concealment and image management, then understanding that condition is essential to understanding her reign. Dismissing the evidence as inappropriate or sexist is just another way of suppressing inconvenient facts. The most revealing moment in this ongoing cover-up came in 2003, on the 400th anniversary of Elizabeth's death, when a coalition of universities and museums formally petitioned for permission to conduct non-invasive scanning of her tomb. The technology they proposed to use could examine the skeletal remains through the lead coffin without opening it, without disturbing anything, without even moving the coffin from its current position. The scans would reveal bone structure, proportions, physical characteristics, and definitively answer questions about Elizabeth's biology that have haunted historians for centuries. The proposal was remarkably sophisticated. It included detailed protocols for preserving the tomb's sanctity, promises of absolute confidentiality until results were fully analyzed, and offers to let the Crown review findings before any public release. Every major Tudor historian in Britain endorsed the proposal. The technology was proven, safe, and completely non-invasive. The petition was denied within 3 weeks, faster than any similar request in the modern era. The official reason given was respect for the dead and the sanctity of royal burial sites, which sounds reasonable until you realize that every other significant English monarch has been examined, scanned, or exhumed for historical research without such concerns. Richard III was dug up from under a parking lot in 2012 and subjected to comprehensive DNA testing, CT scans, and facial reconstruction. Henry VII's tomb was opened in 1813 for examinations. Medieval kings have been studied extensively. Even ancient Egyptian pharaohs are routinely examined with the same technology that was proposed for Elizabeth. But not Elizabeth. Never Elizabeth. The establishment's explanation is that Elizabeth is somehow special, somehow more deserving of permanent undisturbed rest than every other historical figure, but this explanation is transparently false. The real reason for the denial is that whoever makes these decisions knows or strongly suspects that scanning Elizabeth's skeleton would reveal something that would fundamentally challenge the historical narrative we've all been taught. That sealed coffin is protecting a secret, and that secret almost certainly relates to skeletal structures that would indicate biological sex. So here's where we are 421 years after Elizabeth's death. We have official royal wardrobe records documenting that she consistently wore size 12 shoes throughout her adult life, shoes larger than those worn by her giant father and most of the men at her court. We have contemporary descriptions from professional diplomats, noting her unusually large hands and feet, her masculine stride, and her physical form that wasn't like other women. We have Spanish intelligence reports stating with certainty that she couldn't bear children for specific biological reasons. We have the mysterious disappearance of her shoemaker right when marriage negotiations were reaching their peak. We have her lifetime of concealing clothing choices that hid her feet and body shape beneath architectural disguises. We have the suspicious speed with which her body was sealed in a coffin after death and the removal of everyone who witnessed its preparation. And we have 4 centuries of institutional resistance to examining that sealed tomb, even with technology that could answer definitively whether Elizabeth's skeletal structure matches biological male or female patterns. Put all of this evidence together and a clear picture emerges. Elizabeth I had physical characteristics that didn't match what 16th century people expected from a woman. Characteristics she spent her entire reign desperately concealing, and characteristics that modern establishment historians are still trying to suppress discussion of. Whether Elizabeth was born with some intersex condition or was the legendary Bisley Boy who replaced a dead princess, her size 12 feet are documented historical fact that points toward a truth the establishment desperately wants to keep buried. If you found this evidence as compelling as I did, subscribe to this channel right now, because we're uncovering the historical secrets that mainstream academia refuses to acknowledge. Hit that like button if you believe it's finally time to scan Elizabeth's tomb and end 400 years of speculation with actual scientific evidence. And drop your theory in the comments below. Do you think Elizabeth's size 12 feet proves she was biologically male, or is there another explanation for why she wore shoes larger than most men in her court? Your insights might reveal connections that historians have deliberately ignored for centuries. The truth is sitting in sealed archives in a sealed coffin, and together we can demand that it finally see daylight.